merger, Sallie Mae Navient was the largest servicer of federal student loans. They also have a private student loan business and a collections business. And it's become a household name because of controversies around placing borrowers in forbearance instead of working with them to get them into income-based programs, which has resulted in the accrual, capitalization of interest, and people owing more in loans than they had actually borrowed. And there was a couple of years ago a settlement with the DOJ and the Department of Defense about Navient overcharging active duty service members on their student loans. Its Pioneer Debt Collection Wing also lost a contract with the federal government. And of the student loan complaints received by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Navient was always the most common, with complaints centered on the company's customer service not providing clear and adequate information that was sufficient to allow borrowers to understand repayment options and choose the best options for their personal situation. This one's been, Navient is a bit of an enemy of the millennials and Gen Xers around the country. So it was a interesting target and not necessarily a labor-based target. And that's something to point out, is that there's a lot of different targets and things you can do. So within the larger context of 44 million people in the U.S. owing a combined $1.4 billion in debt, with 9 million of those borrowers in default, more struggling to keep up. You've got shifting federal government policies that a lot of issue experts fear are only going to make some of these problems worse. And when it comes down to consumer debt, only mortgages outrank when it comes down to consumer debt, only mortgages outrank student debt. And when households are struggling to make ends meet, student loan payments are usually the first thing to go. They're more likely to take a backseat to rent or mortgage payments, auto loan installation payments, credit card payments. So some people call this a student debt crisis, but it's really just clear there is a mess here that is resulting from a generation of bad fiscal policy by federal and state governments, and partially to some extent the private actors. So we worked with the Treasurer of Rhode Island to submit a proposal requesting that the board report on what the company, Navient, is doing to more effectively monitor and manage the financial and reputational risks related to this student debt crisis mess. Including whether or how they took that info into consideration when calculating the CEO's performance pay. So similar reports asking for risk analyses based on social policy issues are a frequent subject of shareholder proposals, especially when it comes to things like climate or company gender diversity, racial diversity. But this was the first of its kind. It's an important issue for shareholders for several reasons. As it was then the largest player in the game when we filed this proposal, so any shocks to the student loan market are sure to have some impact on the company's revenues. And the company is more exposed to financial risks arising from the student debt crisis than other companies. And it relies on contracts with the federal government to maintain its market share and its profitability. So with the previous incidents that indicate that the company may have insufficient internal controls or policies to prevent another major controversy like the service member scandal, there's quite a bit of concern. As student debt becomes more of a social policy issue, there's the increased risk of reputational damage as the company continues to draw more attention. So as owners of Navient, as shareholders, it's our right to know how the company is assessing the trends of increasing debt and how it is or is not, how the company is or is not preparing for certain potential eventualities that would impact share price and profits, as well as how the board holds senior management accountable for controlling for these situations and ensuring that things go well internally. So because this was a unique proposal, it was closely watched by a lot of folks within the ESG space. Of course, the company fought it, sought to exclude it at the SEC. We were pleasantly surprised. The SEC did not grant permission to exclude the proposal before the company ran into its deadline for publishing its proxy materials. We didn't actually get a response to our defense, which was a very long defense, lengthy and detailed. So it just kind of by default went into Navient's materials. In this situation, we weren't expecting a lot of support, but we got on the phone with the proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis, and they supported us. And then we found out that other institutional investors supported this proposal. And the final vote on the proposal was 42.8% of all votes cast, well above the minimum needed to refile, and a number that requires Navient's board to, sit up and listen to shareholders about this. So now we're able to engage with the company on the issue for increased transparency, and we'll see where this goes. But we're now building a relationship with the company just based off of this to hopefully help the company remain profitable, become more profitable, and serve student loan borrowers in a better way for everybody. So it's a whole different area than maybe a labor dispute, and it didn't happen in the shareholder meeting, but we now have access to the board and the ability to work with the company, which is going to be hopefully a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great. Maybe you can expand just a little bit, because I think you touched on this. What kind of issues do you think really lend themselves to this kind of activism?
So, of course, at the SEC, they have requirements. So the scope and subject of shareholder proposals are limited by statute, and they have to be about benefiting the company and shareholders. They can't be about a personal grievance, okay? So that kind of takes out like the idea of bringing a shareholder proposal on an individual labor grievance. And of course, the proposals can be excluded for matters of ordinary business, with something that's inappropriate for shareholders to have to think about and make decisions about, or that it micromanages the company. So if you want something very, very specific, that's not going to work. If the underlying subject is not economically relevant to the company's finances, it's not going to work. So if it's something small, like I don't know, like an ingredient in cosmetics for a company that is just like a larger chemical company that only does like 1% of its revenue is cosmetics, that might be possibly excluded for economic irrelevance. And then there's the idea of substantial implementation. The company's already done it. So if it's not doing enough of what you want it to do, it might be better to engage directly rather than try to move it through shareholder campaigns. We tend to see the ordinary business argument the most frequently, but if a proposal deals with a matter of a significant issue of social policy, for instance, student debt, you can get past that. So those are other, one of the big categories of things that you want to look for is something larger, overarching, and right now we're seeing a lot around gender diversity, climate change, sexual harassment policies, and apparently student debt. So we haven't been confirmed that the SEC sees it as a social policy issue. But whatever.
Go ahead.
Whatever the objective of the proposal, asking the board to adopt the policy or prepare a report, you have to be able to make a solid argument for shareholder value. So whatever your proposal is, it has to be about increasing shareholder value, benefiting the shareholder owners who are there to hold the board accountable. And other types of campaigns are vote no campaigns, where you reject the CEO's pay package because the CEO has done something, or you need to pressure the CEO around something. Similarly, vote no on an individual board member or a slate of board members who are not benefiting the company as they should. But no matter what kind of campaign you're looking at, the most important thing is to be able to make a strong financial argument for the thing that you want. You have to be able to convince other investors, and in particular institutional investors, that your campaign, your proposal is going to help shareholder value.
I would just, if I could jump in here.
You had a comment, yeah.
Oh, yeah, thanks, David. So I certainly agree with everything that's just been said, and I would just add to it that, a lot of Sarah's comments focused on sort of a particular form of activism in publicly held companies, which is, the shareholder proposal route. And that's certainly a key route. There are other ones too that I would just mention also. So for one thing, in the public company context, sometimes litigation has been a form of activism. In the usual case, that's really, in sort of extreme circumstances where you have some kind of a securities fraud or you have some kind of a merger going on, and you're worried about certain self-serving activity, perhaps by the board or the CEO or whatever. And actually, there's a pretty strong empirical track record showing that when public pension funds have gotten involved, labor union funds have gotten involved, well, particularly on the public pension side, that they tend to get better results for shareholders in terms of paying lower attorneys' fees and having higher recoveries. And there have even been some interesting cases of like books and records searches looking into certain things that have been brought. The other piece of it I'd also mention is activism sort of outside the public company context, and that is sort of at alternatives, activism vis-a-vis private equity funds or hedge funds. I mean, some of the most exciting, interesting activism has taken place on that front as well. We've seen a couple of years ago, for example, the American Federation of Teachers published a kind of hedge fund watch list when it became clear that a lot of hedge funds were turning around and supporting charter schools or doing things that otherwise jeopardize, undermine the very teacher pensions that they were managing in their portfolios. You know, they'd be taking teacher pension money and investing it, and then turning around attacking teacher pensions. There was some interesting pushback there, led by the American Federation of Teachers, and also in the private equity space, we've seen some interesting steps that public pension funds have taken vis-a-vis private equity, some of it lowering fees, some of it relates to the responsible contractor policy I mentioned before about, hiring of union labor. And by the way, there is a financial case for the hiring of responsible contractors, for the hiring of union labor, which gives you better skilled work, lower risk of injury, lower risk of liability, et cetera, in such situations. So I agree with the comment that it's also about making a financial case, and that activism can extend beyond the publicly held company side of the portfolio to include alternatives as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're talking about, there's no sort of voting involved. It's really kind of the potential for voting with your feet, I suppose. The pension thing. We're not doing this, and go ahead, sir.
And it's very interesting because, it's true that when you're in the public company context, you're filing shareholder proposals. You have, the context of it is you have to try to aim typically to attract as many shareholders as you can with that proposal. I mean, the higher the vote you get, the better off you are. And of course, if you get past the magic number of 50%, that's even better. So you are trying to take a broader based approach. The business model is a bit different in hedge funds and private equity funds. They make money oftentimes, even before they profit, they make money because they get a cut off the top of whatever investment you make in them. And as a result, if you shift to a different fund manager, which there's a fair amount of legal flexibility to do that. There can be some contractual limitations, but that can affect the bottom line of the fund manager immediately. They want to keep these pension funds and labor union funds as clients. And so, yes, it does give you a little bit more authority and a little bit more of ability to have an impact sometimes. It's a slightly different context with some slightly different tools, but I think ultimately motivated by the same activist intentions and outcomes.
Yeah, I think this highlights the importance of company engagement, whether a public company or an alternative investment vehicle or a closely held corporation. That interacting with the company, engaging with the company, with the board, with management, with the investment advisors is very important, and that's one of the areas why public pensions, because of their sheer size, as David mentioned, the investment managers don't want to lose those accounts, and so they're able to use some of their weight to push things towards the responsible contracting policies that require fair wages benefits and the use of training on real estate investments and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, David, I think reading your book, you make a big point about the importance of public defined benefit pension plans, union defined benefit pension plans for this strategy. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, one thing that I worry about a lot is this very strong across-the-board attack on public pension funds, which has echoes of the attack like via the Janus case, for those who may be familiar with it, on unions. And there's a similar attack on worker pension funds. And that attack is financed by many of the same folks who pushed the Janus case. And it takes almost every form: ballot initiatives, proposed legislation, academic conferences, lawsuits, etc. And the main goal of this attack on public pension funds in particular is to convert them all into individually managed 401ks. I have a 401k. That's what I've got. That is, and many people do. But there are a lot of problems with 401ks. I should back up and I should say that the pretext for this reform movement is about the whole question of public pension fund underfunding, and are they underfunded or not, and how much. And there's an intense debate about that in the among economists and actuaries. My concern is wherever you stand on that question, in some cases the cure is worse than the disease. Why is that? Well, individually, 401ks, first of all, as an asset class, have been very problematic. Even the people who invented them have basically renounced them in recent press reports, including in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. There's a serious underfunding problem with 401ks, too. The fees are quite high, and sometimes have been very high, and the performance is, not wonderful necessarily, and there's widespread evidence that people don't have enough in these 401ks to retire on. So you might ask the question, why is there such a strong push to convert everybody into a 401k when they themselves don't have a very good track record? And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one of them I think has to do with undercutting precisely the shareholder activism that we're talking about here. I think it's a necessary precondition. You can sense it in Sarah's comments and in things that I said earlier. A necessary precondition of activism is that you have pooled sources of capital, right? One of the reasons why public pension funds and even labor union funds are important investors is because CalPERS, for example, California Public Employee Retirement System, is sitting on $350 billion of assets, right? Shifting those assets in one direction or another has a very big economic effect. When they show up and they're not happy with the CEO's pay, or they're thinking about bringing a lawsuit or whatever it may be, that really catches the attention. When they decide they want to file a shareholder proposal, that really catches the attention of the board, of management, etc. I've got it in, right, and if they adopt a responsible contractor policy, as the New York City pension funds did, that has significant economic effect. Those are $160 billion in pension funds. I can assure you, I don't take it personally, but absolutely nobody cares if David Weber, with his 401k, adopts a responsible contractor policy, right? It's trivial. I don't count. But so this is the problem. If you take a big fund like a CalPERS and break it up into millions of individually managed 401ks, I think you really lose almost all the leverage. And it's to me, the analogy is a pension is like a union and a 401k is like right to work. You break, just like an individual worker has very little clout to renegotiate their income or their working conditions, because the boss could just say, well, there's the door if you're not happy. But in a union, they have much more clout. Same thing. If you have an individual 401k, you have very little clout. But if you're part of a large pooled set of investments, a large pooled fund, you do have more clout. And I think the evidence supports that claim. And so that's what I worry about. I worry that this effort to break up all these big pension funds into individual accounts is really going to undercut the ability to engage in activism. And, we 401k holders, I like to say, are like the world's ideal source of capital. we don't know what's going on. We don't know where our money's invested. We don't understand the fees that we're paying. We don't know how much the CEO of company XYZ makes. We're not paying attention, which is perfect from the perspective of Wall Street and others, is that we turn over our money and we do very little to monitor it. That's not true, but big pension funds, labor union funds have the capacity to monitor and to exercise authority. And I actually think that benefits the entire market, not just the pensions themselves. And I worry a lot that that's under attack and people don't appreciate what would disappear if the other side succeeds at this.
Yeah, and because it does sound like there's a political dimension to this. Do you have some thoughts on who's behind some of these attacks?
Well, it's clear that some of these attacks are being funded in various forms by the Koch brothers and by the Arnold Foundation and by other organizations. And you see that in many forms. You see it directly with sponsoring ballot initiatives, with sponsoring academic conferences hostile to pensions. So it takes a variety of different forms. It's well funded. Ballot initiatives in California have been funded in various cities by folks who are plainly hostile to these big public pension funds. And so that's where the attacks are coming from. That's where the money is coming from. And I think in part it's because people realize that these pensions do have significant clout. And I'm not saying that there's no issues with underfunding and that underfunding isn't part of the story. I think it is. But the thing is like, even if you do have underfunding issues, there are so many answers to that other than breaking everybody up into individually managed accounts, individually managed 401ks. And that's why I think at least part of the story is about breaking up this shareholder voice that workers and pensions have.
Sarah, how do you, as working with the AFL-CIO, how do you reach out to public pensions? How does that work in terms of mobilizing the leverage that's potentially available there?
Sure. So we are, pretty limited in who we can, work with, and that would be the worker union trustees to these pension funds. And we have our proxy voting guidelines, and there's the trustee leadership forum, and several other tools that are used to educate trustees on the best ways to, vote based on labor values. And then through there, we, talk within and among the different unions and, what are your issues? What are you looking to do? And it's a lot of, a lot of communication and solidarity.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe you could tell us about another campaign that you worked on or is going on right now, just to, again, give us a little granular feel for this.
Sure, and I guess it would be another shareholder campaign from this past proxy season that demonstrates some of the ways that solidarity and cooperation amongst the different plans can help. And so at Marriott International, we had a pretty simple, fairly non-controversial shareholder proposal around simple majority votes and eliminating supermajority requirements in the company's charter and bylaws. This is pretty non-controversial in the investor and especially institutional investor world, and is one more popular proposal right now because it prevents entrenchment of board members and it allows more shareholder democracy. Very important things, especially when you are a worker owner trying to reach the board. The proposal passed, but that was not the important thing that happened that day. This year's meeting, a group of women who work for Marriott hotels used their pension and the pension of other union members for the pension funds that owned Marriott stock to attend the meeting as representatives of the pension plans. And in these shareholder meetings, there's often a question and answer period. And this was a unique experience for these workers. They were able to confront the board, the CEO, senior management, everybody face to face about an issue that they've been dealing with at work. And so housekeepers, restaurant servers, bartenders, kitchen staff, they normally never have the chance to look the big bosses in the eye, let alone ask them the kind of pressing questions about company policies and actions. In this case, to address sexual harassment of hospitality workers and gender diversity and equity within the company. These women got up, asked questions during the Q&A period, and this is not something that tends to happen at shareholder meetings. So it caused a bit of a ruckus, got quite a lot of media attention, and the workers were able to secure a private meeting with the head of HR and several other members of senior management to discuss the issue, and company policies, and what could be done to improve, and now have a working relationship then with management to work on these policies.
It seems like a very constructive outcome in the end.
Yeah, it was, and it was a lot of fun.
So, David, I was going to shift gears a little bit. As you know, the U.S. Department of Labor issued a new guidance. It was a field assistance bulletin that came out in April. We don't want to get too far into ERISA, but the thing I wanted to just ask you to comment on is there was a specific language in that guidance on shareholder engagement by pension plans, and just kind of hearing the sort of the buzz out in the trade press and conferences and so on. There's a concern that this might have a kind of a chilling effect on the willingness of pensions and pension trustees to engage in this kind of activity. And I'm sure you have thoughts on that, so I thought maybe I'd just give you a chance to comment.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting that the DOL did this through a field assistance bulletin and not through an interpretive bulletin, which, not to get too much into the legal weeds here, but this has been a political football that's gone back and forth for years. I mean, when the Clinton administration sort of liberalized the interpretation around fiduciary duty and taking into account ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors, and then when Bush came to office, they kind of tried to tighten it up a little bit. Then Obama liberalized it again, and people were expecting this from Trump when they got into office. I think it's important to note they didn't pull the most recent interpretive bulletin, which was issued in the Obama administration. They didn't overrule it. They just kind of express what, a little grumpiness, I suppose, in just trying to remind everybody to keep their eyes on costs and keep their eyes on, performance in the interest of the fund and so forth. Do I think that this should chill? No, I don't think it should. I think it's always been the case that these pensions have understood that they have to take into account, the investment factors in making these investment decisions and keep that top of mind. And I think, folks have been disciplined about doing that. I have my own questions and have raised my own questions in some scholarly work about whether the law even really requires that and the extent to which it's been interpreted in ways that I sometimes think get far away from the actual language of ERISA, et cetera. The other thing to remember too is that these pronouncements govern really the labor union funds, which are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Department of Labor. Public pension funds, on the other hand, are typically governed by the state pension codes of the states in which they operate, and so that's a little bit different. It's not they're not necessarily governed by what the Department of Labor has to say. So I mean, I think at this point, as long as funds are keeping top of mind, or keeping in their focus, the investment goals and the performance of the fund for retirement, these other factors can also be taken into account. That's been clear in the law for a long time, and I don't believe that that's been changed by this most recent pronouncement.
Okay, and that ties back, I think, to some comments Sarah made earlier about needing to sort of keep the financial objectives of your activism kind of front and center. So really, certainly no dramatic change coming from the Labor Department there. Sarah, you had mentioned the AFL-CIO proxy voting guidelines, and I wanted to just give you a chance to talk a little bit more about those, just let the audience know, a little more detail. What are they? What are their objectives? How do you update those? And importantly, how can people make use of them?
Sure, and the proxy voting guidelines are available on our website, aslcio.org. And the guidelines were developed to serve as a guide for pension trustees in meeting their fiduciary duty to plan participants and beneficiaries. So it's a guide on how to vote and what the different requirements for voting are. The guidelines emphasize a long-term view of value creation, which has served as the foundation of capital stewardship by pension employee benefit funds. And the guidelines can be adopted by any pension or employee benefit fund for their own voting fiduciary guidelines. And we invite people to use them as a model to develop their own institutional investor guidelines. And they're all about helping institutional investors who are interested in these issues to exercise their voting rights in order to focus corporations on building long-term value, which provides healthier financial returns, employment growth, and retirement security for everyone. It's a win-win-win-win-win when these kind of the kind of corporate governance rules or guidance or models that are discussed in the proxy voting guidelines are followed. So they can be found, of course, on our website, and in addition to the information about best practices of corporate governance and the role of various actors. It provides basic education on requirements under ERISA, which we mentioned earlier, like fiduciary duty. It reminds me about a little bit of the fiduciary duty and ESG, or socially responsible investing. And the data shows, and we don't talk about this in the proxy guidelines, but the data shows that what are called ESG screens or requirements that you would put over in making your decisions actually produces higher returns and even will beat the market versus exchange traded funds, which is not in the proxy guidelines, but that's something to point out with fiduciary duty and how squishy some of this stuff can be, and how sensitive to legal interpretation that can shift these things can be. And so providing guidance for people, especially worker trustees who aren't educated in business and finance, is just one of the many roles that we serve with the guidelines.
Yeah, and David, I think you mentioned, but it's probably worth underlining, the comment that this kind of activism, has the potential to benefit the market as a whole. Not right. Necessarily just, the sort of the objectives of the individual shareholder or activist, but really a broader benefit.
Well, look, this goes to the point that in my view, and certainly not my view alone, these pension funds, these labor union funds, these public pension funds, their actual interests, their self-interests are very well correlated with, I think, what we would most want from the market, which is long-term economic growth and long-term healthy economic growth, long-term prosperity, right? These pension funds, they're not like hedge funds, which can move in and out of stocks quickly. They're not like private equity funds, which may do the same or may not moving in and out of stocks, but they, may have shorter term business models. These pension funds have to pay out retirement benefits over 30, 40-year time horizons. And they're also diversified. They're diversified investors. And so they own the whole market. They've been sometimes called universal owners, right? And so when they act, particularly on the corporate governance piece, oftentimes their interests really do correlate with the interests of other long-term investors. And that's why I think they've played, for example, a leading role in the corporate governance movement, in improving shareholder voting, in pursuing things like say on pay and proxy access and things like that. When you give when you make companies more responsive to shareholder input, that doesn't just benefit the shareholder that filed the proposal. It benefits shareholders generally, benefits the market generally. And there's a fair amount. I mean, for example, on the proxy access issue, which basically is what allows certain shareholders, long-term diversified shareholders, to actually get their own nominee on the ballot or proxy for an annual meeting and shareholder vote, right? There's been a number of studies that show that improves shareholder value and correlates with shareholder value. So I think that's exactly right. Oftentimes, the activism of these pension funds benefits everybody in the market, benefits small players like me or people who have a 401k. Or an individual investor and have no opportunity really to exercise any meaningful voice. So absolutely, I think there's a strong case suggesting that this activism has benefited not just the folks who are putting it forward, but everybody else too.
Sarah, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about kind of what are the priorities of your office these days. No secrets needed, but just kind of where are you guys focusing your attention? Where do you see the opportunities going forward in the whole shareholder activist corporate governance area?
And it's actually a great transition from what David was just talking about, because where I see things going is more ESG and more focus on human capital management. I just came. Literally just came from an academic roundtable discussing these issues, but it's found that companies that have good employment practices return higher value to the shareholders and tend to have higher earnings than their competitors in the industry. And so looking at that and how we can move that, and who else is coming into this place, we're seeing the alternatives become more and more interested in ESG. I think Larry Fink's CEO letter last year caught a lot of attention with his focus on ESG, and BlackRock has its own ESG fund. So this is where I see things going in general, and I think as longtime leaders of that kind of movement, you're just going to see more of us in that space, pushing the envelope, trying to further develop the standards of what it means to be a good employer and what that means for investors. And, as David mentioned, every investor in the company and the entire economy as a whole, especially when you're talking about factors that improve jobs numbers and wages or reduce carbon greenhouse gases, these kind of things. That's where I see it all going, and it's very exciting right now.
I'll just interpose that, as you mentioned, Larry Fink is the president of BlackRock, which I believe is the largest asset manager on the planet.
Yes.
And so that letter that you mentioned, talking about the need to include this kind of analysis, taking into account environmental, social, and governance issues, I think really was, sort of landed like a bit of a bombshell in the financial community. So thank you for bringing that up.
Mm-hmm.
Kara, I'm just going to touch base with you. I don't know if there's any questions have come in. I've got a couple more questions for David and Sarah, but if there are questions from the audience, we could pick them up.
Actually, I did not get any questions, so I think the conversation is just kind of going well, and people are just tuning in and listening to that. So please go on with your questions.
Sure. Actually, David, I was thinking, maybe I'd ask you kind of a forward-looking question as well, which is, addressing, sort of the labor-focused activists, other progressives. What are your thoughts in terms of how they should direct their activities, particularly as it relates to shareholder activism, opportunities for activism, maybe opening that up even more. What are your thoughts, kind of looking forward?
Well, I guess I would categorize them as defensive and offensive. I mean, in terms of defensive, I do want to raise the alarm a little bit about getting people to focus on the the pension issues that I was raising before, on understanding the importance of retaining the pooled nature of these investment funds, because that really is a source of power. And it's not that look, there have been some efforts to organize individual investors through 401ks and mutual funds and such, and that's fine. But the reality is the kind of clout that's exercised through these pooled investment vehicles is very important to protect. And so part of me just wants to make sure everybody is paying attention to what's going on this whole pension fund side of the equation. That's the defensive point, which is just sort of protecting those pension funds from too many attacks. On the other side of the equation, going forward, apart from wanting to see the continuation of much of the activism that Sarah was describing in those efforts and shareholder proposals and so forth, I would like to see some more. I would love to see the scaling up of responsible contractor policies like the ones that New York City adopted. I would like to see more focus on thinking about workers and hiring workers and making the case for union labor. As I said before, there are entities, the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust, OLICO, and others that have been operating for years, profitably, making sound investments that also use and hire union labor. And that's the kind of thing that can have a positive feedback effect, that can create a virtuous circle, right? Which is you create more jobs, which creates more workers, puts more people to work, and they can then in turn contribute to these funds, right? So that can be good for the fund. The economic interest, obviously returns matter. Returns matter to the economic health of any fund. But that's just one of the three legs. The other two legs are employee contributions and employer contributions, right? And so making those kinds of investments can also benefit your fund in terms of returns, but also in terms of employer and employee contributions. So I would like to see some more focus on that. I think it's a critically important time. We know that who knows where infrastructure investment is going to go, but it seems at some point we have to have a significant program for infrastructure investment in this country. And that would seem to me, particularly if you've got responsible contractor policies in place, that would seem to me to be an opportunity for these pension funds to invest in ways that put people back to work and help their bottom line, while also helping workers. So I'd like to see more of that coming up in the next few years.
Yeah, and that raises some interesting issues, as you'd raised before, about some of the opposition to these pensions, and then maybe some of the discomfort with these infrastructure proposals, which seems so much common sense, and yet they don't move forward.
Yep. I mean, it's the Democrats have already basically passed a plan. We'll see. Trump had talked a lot about it on the campaign trail, but it's kind of quietly slipped away. I'm guessing largely because of Republican opposition on the Hill. Who knows if maybe this upcoming election could change some of those dynamics a little bit. In the meantime, there are, Blackstone, we were talking about Blackstone before. Blackstone has raised $100 billion infrastructure investment fund, and they adopted, after this New York City responsible contractor policy was adopted, they adopted it too and said that they're going to apply the policy to their infrastructure investment fund. I think that's a perfect example of the productive ways in which this investment power can be used, and you don't necessarily have to wait around for a massive package from Washington to make it happen.
Yeah, and of course, ULICO has an infrastructure fund as well.
Yes.
There any last words on?
David, actually, I did have one question that just popped up here.
Yeah,
if I can answer before we wrap up. It was actually a question for Sarah. The question was, have there been any concrete steps taken by Marriott yet as a result of the direct dialogue that the workers recently had with them about sexual harassment and other workplace concerns?
So I can't fully answer that question because that's being handled by the workers in their union, and I haven't been involved in that part of it. But in the meeting, they did get a commitment for the development of technology for panic buttons that would be rolled out, not just in the places where it's been mandated, but across all Marriott properties. As far as what has been executed so far, I'm not sure. But you're pointing to the need to remain engaged with companies. Don't just take their word for it. Continue to follow up. And that's one of the benefits you get as an owner, is that they do have to answer to you. They do have to follow up with you. And so, we'll be continuing to watch that. And Unite Here will also be watching that closely.
Great. Okay. Yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Sarah, any other last words before we sign off?
I say go forth and invest ethically.
Go forth and invest ethically. I like that.
That's a great way to end. So again, David David Weber and Sarah Lewis, thank you so much. This has been incredibly informative, and we really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Hand it back to Carrie and sign off.
Yes. Thank you, everybody, for participating. And again, I encourage you to visit our heartlandnetwork.org website for whenever new webinars are going to be released, as well as sign up for our Heartland Espresso e-journal newsletter that gets sent out every other week with some great stories and information about what's happening in the responsible investing world. And I thank you all for your participation. Have a great day.